There's a photograph taken on the morning of September 27th, 1945, in a reception room of the American Embassy in Tokyo. Two men stand side by side against a plain wall. On the left is General Douglas MacArthur, 65 years old, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, in an open-necked khaki shirt with no tie, no medals, and no jacket, his hands resting easily on his hips. On the right is Hirohito, the 124th Emperor of Japan, 44 years old, in a formal morning coat, striped trousers, and a stiff white collar, his arms pressed flat to his sides, his heels together. The photographer was an American Army sergeant named Gaetano Fayas. The Japanese Home Ministry tried to stop the newspapers from printing it. The occupation authorities overruled them, and 2 days later it ran across the entire country. The man on the right kept his throne for another 43 years. He died in the palace on January 7th, 1989, still emperor, the longest reigning monarch in Japanese history. The people standing just outside the edge of that photograph did not. Within 2 years, Prince Nashimoto Morimasa, a field marshal of the Imperial Japanese Army and the chief priest of the Grand Shrine of Ise, was in a cell in Sugamo prison as a suspected Class A war criminal, aged 71. Prince Higashikuni Naruhiko, a general, an uncle by marriage to the emperor, and the only member of the imperial family in the entire history of Japan to serve as prime minister, was standing behind a counter in a plywood shack near the west exit of Shinjuku Station, wearing a shopkeeper's apron, selling second-hand American Army surplus to people who had been taught since childhood that his bloodline was divine. Yi Yun, the last crown prince of Korea and a lieutenant general in the Japanese Army, held no citizenship at all, not Japanese, not Korean, and no government on earth would issue him a passport. The Takeda family's Tokyo Palace, built in 1911, was sold off and became the grounds of a hotel that still operates today. 51 people lost their names in a single afternoon. Almost nobody outside Japan knows this part. What follows is the whole story. From the constitution that made an emperor into a god, to the law the Japanese parliament passed 3 weeks ago that is trying, 79 years late, to undo some of it. The details are stranger and more brutal than most people expect. There are shopkeepers who used to be generals. There's a man buried as a crown prince who died without a country. There's a hotel chain in Tokyo, named, quite literally, after the princes whose homes it was built on top of. And underneath all of it sits one question, which is the question this whole account is built to answer. Every other monarchy that lost a total war in the 20th century was destroyed, shot in a cellar, expelled by law, driven into exile with a suitcase. Japan lost more completely than any of them. Its cities were ash, its army was gone, its emperor had personally approved the war. So how did the oldest continuous monarchy on the planet come out the other side still standing when the empire around it was erased? If you find this kind of history worth preserving, take a second and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps. To understand what happened to them, you first have to understand how it all came apart. It did not begin in 1945. It began in 1889. On February 11th of that year, Japan received a written constitution, drafted under the direction of Ito Hirobumi and modeled closely on Prussia. Article 3 declared the emperor sacred and inviolable. Article 11 gave him supreme command of the army and navy. That second clause has a name in Japanese, Tosuiken, the right of supreme command, and it meant that the armed forces did not answer to the cabinet or the parliament. They answered to the throne, directly, and since the throne was sacred, no politician could question what was done in its name. That single sentence would eventually kill millions of people. There was another word that mattered just as much, kokutai. It translates roughly as national essence or national body, and it meant the unbroken imperial line itself. The idea that Japan was not a country that happened to have an emperor, but a country that existed because it had one, descended without interruption from the sun goddess Amaterasu through the first Emperor Jimmu, whose accession was traditionally dated to 1660 BC. Preserving the kokutai was the highest duty in Japanese public life. Remember that phrase. In August 1945, it becomes the hinge that the entire war turns on. For roughly 40 years, the arrangement worked spectacularly. Japan defeated China in the War of 1894 and 1895, taking Taiwan under the Treaty of Shimonoseki on April 17, 1895. It defeated Russia in 1905, and the peace was brokered by an American president, Theodore Roosevelt, at a Navy yard in Portsmouth, New Hampshire on September 5th of that year. Japan took the southern half of Sakhalin and a foothold in Manchuria. It annexed Korea outright on August 22, 1910, ending a dynasty that had ruled there for more than 500 years. It entered the First World War on the Allied side and walked away with Germany's Pacific Islands. In 50 years, an isolated feudal state had become one of the 5 great powers on Earth. Then the reformers tried to civilize it, and one by one they were murdered. Hara Takashi, the first true party politician to become prime minister, was stabbed to death in Tokyo Station on November 4, 1921. by a railway switchman. Prime Minister Hamaguchi Osachi signed the London Naval Treaty in April 1930, accepting limits on Japanese warships, and was shot in the same station that November by a young ultranationalist. He lingered and died the following August. Inukai Tsuyoshi, who tried to rein in the army in Manchuria, was shot in his official residence on May 15, 1932, by a group of young naval officers who then calmly turned themselves in, and received sentences so light that the leniency itself became a signal. Takahashi Korekiyo, the finance minister who had the nerve to propose cutting the military budget, was hacked and shot to death in his bed on the morning of February 26, 1936. He was 81 years old. That last date is the one that finished Japanese democracy. On February 26, 1936, roughly 1,400 soldiers of the 1st Division seized central Tokyo in heavy snow, killed Takahashi and 2 other senior statesmen, and held the government district for 4 days. They belonged to a faction called the Kodoha, the Imperial Way faction. And their justification was a concept called Gekkokujo, literally the low overcoming the high. The idea that a junior officer may act violently on his own initiative if he believes he is serving the emperor's true will. Hirohito unusually was furious and demanded the rebellion be crushed. It was. 19 men were executed. But the faction that came out on top afterward, the Toseha or Control faction, did not want less military power. It wanted total military power, organized properly through the state. Within a year, that faction had the country. The wars came fast after that. The Manchurian incident of September 18, 1931, when officers of the Kwantung Army blew up a stretch of their own railway and blamed the Chinese, produced the puppet state of Manchukuo. When the League of Nations objected, Japan simply left on March 27, 1933. Full-scale war with China began at the Marco Polo Bridge outside Beijing on July 7, 1937. In December of that year, Japanese forces took the Chinese capital of Nanking, and the field commander who entered the city was a member of the imperial family, Prince Asaka Yasuhiko, an uncle by marriage to the emperor. What happened in Nanking over the following weeks is one of the worst atrocities of the 20th century. Asaka's precise degree of personal responsibility is disputed by historians to this day. What is not disputed is that he was never charged with anything. On September 27, 1940, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy. 6 weeks later, on November 10th, the country staged enormous public celebrations for what it called the 2,600th anniversary of the founding of the empire. 50,000 people gathered in front of the palace. And 13 months after that, on December 7th, 1941, Japanese aircraft hit Pearl Harbor. At its greatest extent in the summer of 1942, the Japanese Empire covered roughly 3 million square miles and stretched from the island of Attu in the Aleutians, off Alaska, south to the Solomon Islands, and from the Burmese frontier of India east to the Gilbert Islands in the Central Pacific. Several 100 million people lived under its flag. Every soldier in it served on paper, 1 man. Then it collapsed almost as fast as it had been built. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers went down at midway between June 4th and June 7th, 1942. Guadalcanal was abandoned in February 1943. Saipan fell in July 1944, which put American bombers in range of Japanese cities and forced the resignation of Prime Minister Tojo Hideki. On the night of March 9th and into the morning of March 10th, 1945, 300 B-29s burned out 16 square miles of Tokyo and killed on the order of 100,000 people in a single night, more than either atomic bomb would kill that day. Okinawa was invaded on April 1st and held out until June 22nd at a cost of more than 100,000 Japanese military dead and a comparable number of Okinawan civilians. Hiroshima was destroyed on August 6th. The Soviet Union declared war and poured into Manchuria on August 9th. Nagasaki was destroyed the same day. The empire had 6 days left. Here's what actually happened in those 6 days, because it is not what most people picture. On the morning of August 14, 1945, the senior leadership of Japan gathered in an underground air raid shelter beneath the palace library. It was humid, poorly ventilated, and lined with concrete. Roughly 24 men in uniforms and formal dress sat on hard chairs in the heat. The government was deadlocked. The civilians wanted to accept the Allied surrender terms. The service chiefs wanted to fight the invasion on the beaches to buy better conditions. Hirohito spoke and said he wished the war ended. That decision, the second of 2, is called the Seiden, the Sacred Judgment. That night, a little before midnight, engineers from the national broadcaster carried recording equipment into the administration building of the Imperial Household Ministry. The emperor read a surrender script onto a set of phonograph discs. He was unhappy with the first attempt and did it twice. His voice was thin and high, and the text was written in an archaic court Japanese that ordinary listeners would struggle to follow. The most famous line in it asks the nation to endure the unendurable. No Japanese civilian had ever heard the emperor's voice in their life, not once. When it was done, the discs were hidden inside the building. They needed to be. At around the same hour, a group of army officers, led by Major Hatanaka Kenji and Lieutenant Colonel Shizaki Jiro, launched a coup to stop the broadcast. Their plan was to seize the palace, find the recordings, destroy them, and isolate the emperor from his advisors, all in the name of preserving the Kokutai. Just after 1 a.m, they went to the office of Lieutenant General Mori Takeshi, commander of the 1st Imperial Guards Division, and asked him to join. He refused. They shot and killed him at his desk, then forged an order in his name under his official seal and used it to move troops into the palace grounds. For the next several hours, on a night with the city blacked out, soldiers went room by room through the imperial palace looking for a set of phonograph records. They cut the telephone lines. They detained the chamberlains. They searched the imperial household ministry building in near darkness. They did not find the discs. Consider what that actually meant. The entire future of the world's oldest monarchy came down to whether a handful of frightened officials had picked a good enough hiding place in the dark. At around 5:30 that morning, in his official residence, the war minister, General Anami Korichika, knelt on the floor in uniform and cut himself open with a short blade. He refused a second to finish him, and he took a long time to die. He left a written testament apologizing to the emperor. By 8 a.m, General Tanaka Shizuichi, commander of the Eastern District Army, had arrived at the palace and personally ordered the rebel troops out. They obeyed. Hatanaka and Shiizaki rode out onto the open plaza in front of the palace, distributed leaflets explaining themselves, and killed themselves there on the gravel a little before 11 o'clock. Tanaka, the man who had put the rebellion down, shot himself 9 days later on August 24th. At noon on August 15th, 1945, the recording was broadcast. Factory workers stood in courtyards. Families knelt in front of radio sets. Many could not understand the vocabulary and had to have it explained afterward. Some wept. Some, outside the palace gates, bowed to the gravel and did not get up for hours. By the traditional count that every Japanese schoolchild had been taught, the dynasty had ruled for 2,605 years, from 660 BC, and Hirohito was its 124th emperor. Historians outside that tradition regard the early portion of that list as legendary and place the first securely documented emperors in roughly the 6th century AD, which still makes it the oldest hereditary monarchy in the world by a margin of about 1,000 years. Either count was about to be tested, the dynasty did not fall. That is the strange fact at the center of everything. The Soviet Union wanted Hirohito tried. Australia and New Zealand wanted him tried. Polls in the United States in the summer of 1945 showed a large majority of Americans wanting him executed or imprisoned. And MacArthur, who had the authority to make it happen, concluded that removing the emperor would require a permanent occupation army of a size the United States would never fund, and that keeping him was the cheapest possible route to a compliant Japan, so the throne was kept. The Kokutai survived. And this is where the story becomes truly heartbreaking, because something had to be sacrificed instead, and the occupation had a very precise idea of what the dismantling was done with paperwork, not violence. On December 15th, 1945, SCAP, the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, meaning MacArthur's headquarters, issued the Shinto Directive, severing the state from the shrine system that had underwritten the emperor's divinity. On January 1st, 1946, Hirohito issued a New Year statement in which he described the notion that the emperor was a living god as a false conception. Japanese has a nickname for it, the Ningen Sengen, the Declaration of Humanity. Then came the money. A new constitution was promulgated on November 3rd, 1946, and took effect on May 3rd, 1947. Article 1 redefined the emperor as the symbol of the state, deriving his position from the will of the people. Article 88 took all property of the imperial household and made it property of the state. On top of that, occupation authorities imposed a one-time capital levy on large fortunes that ran as high as 90%. Look at what that meant in one household. According to a contemporary occupation report, Prince Nashimoto Muramasa held property assessed at 368 million yen. His tax bill was 256 million. His Tokyo house had already burned in the bombing. He sold his country house to pay the government. Then came the register. A new imperial house law was promulgated on January 16, 1947, and it defined membership of the imperial family so narrowly that only the emperor's own household and the households of his 3 younger brothers fit inside it. On October 14, 1947, the Imperial House Council formalized the result. 51 people belonging to 11 collateral princely houses: Fushimi, Kanin, Yamashina, Kitashirakawa, Nashimoto, Kuni, Kaya, Higashi-Fushimi, Asaka, Higashi-Kuni, and Takeda were struck from the imperial register and entered onto ordinary household registers as private citizens. 26 of them were men who had been in the line of succession. A few sources placed the effective date a day or 3 later. The register entry is dated the 14th. 40 of the 51 received a one-time payment. The total for all of them together was about 47.5 million yen. Nashimoto, because of his arrest, was explicitly given nothing. To put this in perspective, imagine waking up one morning and being told that your surname, your address, your job, your bank balance, your children's schooling, your right to vote, and your legal identity have all been replaced at once. You now have a household register, like everyone else. You now pay taxes, like everyone else. You now need a ration book, like everyone else. The house you live in has to be sold to settle a tax assessment on a fortune you no longer control. And there is no appeal, because the government that would hear the appeal is itself operating under the orders of a foreign general. They were at least allowed to stay in the country. That is worth pausing on, because it is the exact point where Japan diverges from the other 20th century collapses. When Turkey abolished the caliphate on March 3, 1924, the entire Ottoman family, more than 150 people, was expelled from the country on a few days' notice and put on trains. Some of them were not permitted to return for 50 years. In Japan, nobody was deported. They simply became nobody. It took a single afternoon. Then they had to eat. Higashikuni Naruhiko had commanded the home defense of Japan, had been made prime minister on August 17, 1945, and had presided over the formal surrender aboard an American battleship 2 weeks later. He lasted 54 days in office and resigned in a dispute with the occupation. After losing his status, he opened a shop in the black market that had grown up outside the west exit of Shinjuku Station. It sold dry goods first, then operated as a book agency, then became a second-hand store dealing in American military surplus, then a coffee shop. None of them worked. He founded his own Buddhist religious sect, and the Tokyo authorities ordered it dissolved. He became honorary chairman of an international martial arts federation in 1957, published his wartime diaries in 1958 and his memoirs in 1968, and died of heart failure in Tokyo on January 20th, 1990, at the age of 102, outliving the emperor he had served by almost exactly a year. Nashimoto Morimasa walked out of Sugamo prison on April 13th, 1946, released without charge after 4 months, having been arrested essentially as a hostage to guarantee the emperor's cooperation. He had been the second most senior man in the imperial family. He spent his last years without a settlement, without a military pension, purged from public life, in what surviving accounts describe as real poverty. He died of a heart attack on January 2, 1951, aged 76. Takeda Tsuneyoshi had a better landing than most, and his was still a demolition. A first cousin of the emperor, a staff officer of the Kwantung Army, he retreated to an estate in Chiba to breed racehorses, then launched a company making knitting machines that promptly went bankrupt. What saved him was sport. He had ridden for Japan in the equestrian events at the Berlin Olympics in 1936, and in 1948 he took over the Japan Skating Association. He became president of the Japanese Olympic Committee in 1962, helped organize the Tokyo Games of 1964 and the Sapporo Winter Games of 1972, and sat on the International Olympic Committee from 1967 to 1981. He died of heart failure in May 1992, aged 83. The family's old palace grounds in Tokyo, meanwhile, had been sold. The gatehouse from 1911 still stands, and it is now the entrance to a hotel. And then there is the case that hurts the most, which is the one involving the family that had already been erased once. Yi-un was the last crown prince of Korea, taken to Tokyo as a boy of 10 after the annexation, educated in Japanese military academies, married in 1920 to Princess Masako of the Nashimoto House, in a match arranged as a political symbol. He rose to lieutenant general in the Japanese army. In 1947, he lost his Japanese royal status with everyone else, and because Korea was no longer part of Japan, he lost his nationality entirely. He was, in the plainest sense of the word, stateless. Here is the betrayal. He asked to go home. Syngman Rhee, the first president of South Korea, refused. He had no intention of admitting a rival focus of loyalty to the country, and he regarded the Yi family as collaborators. So the last crown prince of Korea sat in Tokyo, selling off possessions to live, while his family's Akasaka estate was bought up and turned into a hotel that opened in 1955. He was offered a diplomatic post in London in 1960 and declined on grounds of health. In 1961, he had a stroke that left him permanently disabled. He believed, as almost all of them did, that it was temporary. Many of the former princes assumed that once the Americans left, Japan would restore what the Americans had taken. The peace treaty was signed in San Francisco on September 8, 1951, and took effect on April 28, 1952. Japan was sovereign again, and the Japanese government kept the 1947 law exactly as the occupation had written it, word for word. Nothing was ever given back. Yi-un finally went home on November 22, 1963, after President Park Chung-hee reversed Rhee's decision. Americans will recognize that date for another reason entirely. It was the day John F. Kennedy was shot in Dallas. Crowds lined the road from the airport in Seoul to see the last crown prince return after 56 years. He was carried off the plane unconscious and taken directly to a hospital by ambulance. He almost certainly did not know he had arrived. He spent his final years in Naxionje, a modest hall inside Cheongdeok Palace, and died there on May 1st, 1970, age 72. Think about that for a moment. A man spends his childhood as the heir to a kingdom, his adulthood as a general in the army of the empire that took it, his middle age as a stateless person in a foreign city, and comes home only in a coma. The decency in this story belongs to his wife. Masako, who took the Korean name Yi Bangja and Korean citizenship, chose to go with him to a country that had every reason to resent her, since she was a Japanese princess by birth and the daughter of the man who had been chief priest of Ise. She stayed after he died. She spent the next 2 decades running welfare foundations and schools for children with disabilities in Seoul, financing them in part by selling what she still owned. When she died on April 30th, 1989, 1 day short of 19 years after her husband, Korean mourners turned out for her. She's buried beside him at Namyangju, outside Seoul. For the rest of them, the slow grind was less dramatic and just as complete. Fushimi Hiroaki, who was 15 years old when his family was struck from the register, has written that the tax bills were unprecedented, that the lump sums were set unilaterally and disappeared almost immediately, and that families had to sell property simply to live. His own family's land in Tokyo became the site of the Hotel New Otani. He has also noted that some former princes, who had never in their lives held a job or negotiated a contract, lost what remained by being cheated outright by criminals. The Kaya branch, he wrote, struggled worst of all because they had been living on imperial household ministry land and therefore had nothing to sell. The Romanovs were shot in a cellar in 11 minutes. This took 11 households about 11 years. So what does it look like now in 2026? The main line is intact and very small. Naruhito, born February 23rd, 1960, became the 126th emperor on May 1st, 2019, the day after his father Akihito, born December 23, 1933, became the first Japanese monarch to abdicate since Emperor Kokaku in 1817, a gap of 202 years. Empress Masako was born in 1963 and worked as a diplomat before her marriage. Their only child, Princess Aiko, born December 1st in 2001, graduated from university and has worked for the Japanese Red Cross Society since April 2024. She is barred from the throne. The heirs number 3, Crown Prince Fumihito, the emperor's younger brother, born November 30th, 1965. Fumihito's son, Hisahito, born September 6th, 2006. And Prince Hitachi, born in 1935, who was 90. On September 6, 2025, Hisahito went through the crown-wearing rite called the Kaken no Gi at the Imperial Palace, the first coming-of-age ceremony for a male member of the family in 40 years, and told the emperor he would fulfill his duties as an adult. He is now a biology student at the University of Tsukuba, who specializes in insects, and has co-authored a survey of dragonflies on the grounds of his own family's estate. The entire imperial family currently numbers 16 people. The descendants of the 11 erased houses, meanwhile, are ordinary Japanese citizens with ordinary careers, and some of them are extremely well known. Takeda Tsunekazu was born on November 1st, 1947, 18 days after his family stopped being royal. He rode for Japan in show jumping at the 1972 and 1976 Olympics, became president of the Japanese Olympic Committee, led the successful bid for the Tokyo Games, and resigned his positions on March 21st, 2019, during a French corruption investigation. His son, Takeda Tsuneyasu, born in 1975, is one of the most visible commentators in Japan, arguing that the male line must be preserved and that his own family's branch should be brought back. And on July 17, 2026, 3 weeks before this recording, the Japanese parliament actually did something about it. The Diet enacted the first substantive revision to the Imperial House Law since it was written under the occupation in 1947, 79 years. The new law creates a legal path for the imperial family to adopt unmarried male paternal line descendants of the 11 former branch families, the same families struck off the register on October 14, 1947. It also allows princesses to keep their imperial status after marrying commoners, though their husbands and children remain commoners and stay outside the succession. The lower house passed it on July 10th. The upper house passed it a week later, with the ruling coalition and several other parties in favor, and the main opposition, the communists, and Reiwa Shinsengumi against. What it does not do is the thing most Japanese people actually want. Opinion polling has for years shown large majorities in favor of allowing a woman to reign. The new law deliberately sidesteps that question. Aiko remains ineligible. Her cousin, a 19-year-old entomologist, remains the entire future of a 2,000-year-old institution. And nobody yet knows which young man from which of those 11 families will be the first to be adopted back, or whether a country will accept as a prince someone whose family has been buying groceries and filing tax returns for 79 years. That is the part still unfolding right now. Set this against the others and the shape becomes clear. The Romanovs were murdered. Nicholas, Alexandra, and their 5 children shot in a basement in Yekaterinburg on the night of July 16th and 17th, 1918, and buried in a pit. The Habsburgs were legislated out of Austria in April 1919. Emperor Karl died in exile on Madeira on April 1st, 1922, at 34, broke, in a damp house, while his descendants scattered across Europe. The Hohenzollerns did best of anyone. Kaiser Wilhelm II crossed into the Netherlands in November 1918, took an estate at Doorn, brought his furniture out by the trainload, kept a great deal of his money, and died in his own bed in 1941. And his family is still arguing with the German state over restitution today. The Ottomans were expelled en masse in 1924, and the last caliph died in a Paris apartment in 1944. And the Korean royal house, the one Japan itself destroyed in 1910, was simply erased and never came back. Japan is the outlier, and the reason is uncomfortable. This dynasty was not saved by loyalty or by resistance or by public affection, though all three existed. It was saved because the general occupying the country ran the numbers and decided a living emperor was cheaper than a dead one. And the bill for that decision was handed to the relatives. Stripped of their titles, stripped of their houses, stripped of their names, they became the price of continuity. And the institution they paid for is now, 79 years later, quietly asking for their grandsons back. Which leaves the question worth sitting with. Every family in this story lost the same war. One branch kept everything by giving up what it claimed to be, and the other branches kept what they claimed to be and lost everything else. If survival costs you the thing that made you what you were, is it survival? Or is it just a longer kind of ending? Tell me what you think in the comments, and if you want more history like this, subscribe to the channel.